At my father's funeral, I was completely broken. From the next room, I heard my wife. She didn't know I was there and spoke loudly. My father-in-law is gone. Now only he is left, and everything they have will be mine. That night, I made a decision she never expected. Before we go on, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us which city you're tuning in from. The day I buried my father, I discovered that the woman who'd slept by my side for 27 years had already calculated how much time I'd left to live. I didn't find out from a letter. I didn't find out from a message found by chance. I found out because I stepped away for a moment from the living room where the others were, because I needed air, because the weight of that day was crushing my chest in a way I'd never felt before. And stopping in the hallway, with my forehead resting against the cold wall, I heard her voice. It was the voice of Lorena, my wife, my son's mother, the woman I shared a bed, a table in silence with for almost 3 decades, and she was speaking without lowering her volume, with the calmness of someone who's completely sure nobody is listening to her. My name's Augustin Torrealba Medrano. I'm 53 years old. I've been a state tax auditor for 26 years, a profession that, as anyone who practices it knows well, teaches you to read between the lines, to find what hides behind the numbers, to not accept any document without first verifying who signed it, when, and above all, why. But no professional training prepared me for what I heard that gray November Tuesday, standing in my father's hallway, with the smell of withered flowers permeating the air and the distant sound of the neighbors' prayers coming from the living room. My father's name was Isidro Torrealba Vega. He was 81 years old. He'd worked 40 years as a maintenance technician in an electrical components factory in Valladolid, the same city where I was born, where I grew up, where I learned what it means to earn things with your hands. He was a man of few words and precise gestures, the kind who doesn't hug, but shows up, the kind who doesn't say I love you, but takes the car to the shop before you notice something's wrong. He died early on a Saturday morning after 8 months fighting a pancreatic cancer that gave him no truce. I was by his side. I held his hand until he stopped squeezing my fingers. And when I walked out of that hospital room at 4:20 in the morning with the hallway fluorescent lights buzzing over my head, I thought the worst thing that could happen to me in life had already happened. I was wrong. My marriage to Lorena Y. Fuentes Palomino began in September 1996. She was 21. I was 27. We met at a co-worker's wedding, and I thought she was a smart, determined woman with a sense of humor that back then disarmed me. We got married 16 months later, a simple wedding in a small church in downtown Valladolid with 70 people and a cake that leaned to the left during the whole reception. We laughed a lot that night. During the first few years we were, I think, what you could call a functional couple. Not perfect, never perfect. I worked too much. I was absent more than I should have been. There were meetings I didn't cancel when I should have, birthdays I arrived late to, conversations I left halfway, because work always had something more urgent to offer. I admit it without excuses, but I was also the man who paid the mortgage without fail every month for 22 years, who never let anything be missing in that house, who built with his own effort the stability we all lived on. I was present in body and sometimes absent in everything else. That's the whole truth. Our son Alvaro Torrealba's Y. Fuentes was born in August 1998. He's 26 years old. He works as a sound technician for an events company in Madrid and has been living outside Valladolid for 3 years, something I interpreted for a long time as natural independence, and that today I understand in a completely different way. My father's illness started in January. During the first few months, Lorena offered to help with the visits, with managing medical appointments, with the weekly shopping. I was thankful for it. I was working full-time. The trips to my father's house consumed the afternoons, and having someone trustworthy accompanying him eased my burden. Or so I thought. There are details you see and don't register. Things that are perfectly visible there, and yet the brain classifies as normal because it has no reason to suspect. Now, looking back with the clarity that only time and pain give, I see them all with a sharpness that hurts. The first one, for months before my father died, Lorena accompanied him to a notary's office. She told me in passing, almost unimportantly, while making dinner, "I went with your father to sign a medical management authorization just in case. I accepted it as fine, without asking more. It was logical, it was practical. I didn't ask for the document. The second one, in that same period, a bank account statement I didn't recognize appeared at home. Lorena explained to me they'd opened it to manage my father's care expenses, that it was more organized that way, that she was in charge. I nodded. That's how Lorena was. Organized, decisive. I never questioned those kind of things. The third one, Alvaro started avoiding my gaze during family visits in that period. I attributed it to the anticipated pain of losing his grandfather. It was the easiest thing to believe, and I believed it. The fourth one, in one of the last lucid conversations I had with my father a Wednesday afternoon with the sun coming in sideways through his bedroom window, Isidro told me something I didn't know how to interpret until much later. He stared at me and said, "Take care of what's yours, Augustine. Don't trust someone who takes care of you too much all of a sudden." I asked him what he meant. He stayed quiet, closed his eyes, and didn't bring the subject up again. I kept that phrase somewhere in my memory, like someone folding a piece of paper, not knowing yet what it'll be useful for. Weeks later, it had become the piece that explains everything. The day of the funeral, my father's apartment living room was full of people who loved Isidro in their own way. Already retired factory co-workers, lifelong neighbors, a couple of cousins we hadn't seen in years. I endured for hours receiving hugs, saying thank you, repeating the same words with my voice increasingly hollow. At some point in the afternoon, without telling anyone, I got up and went out to the hallway. I needed a minute, just a minute. The hallway was cold. The door to the room on the right, the one that was my parents' bedroom for decades, was ajar. And from inside came Lorena's voice, clear, unhurried, with the confidence of someone speaking in a place she already considers hers. The father-in-law already died. Pause. Now he's the only one left. Another pause. A small, almost intimate laugh. And everything they have will be mine. I froze. My hands stopped responding to me. My lungs closed as if someone had clenched a fist inside my chest. My eyes fixed, without any logical reason, on the rusty bathroom door handle right in front of me. An irregularly shaped rust stain, brown over gray metal. I looked at it for what must have been 10 or 15 seconds, although at that moment I had no notion of anything. I didn't go in, I didn't say anything, I didn't make any noise. I backed away slowly, went back to the living room, sat down, and shook the hand of someone whose name I don't remember anymore. But somewhere in the coldest and stillest part of myself, something had settled with a clarity I'd never felt before. Lorena thought she'd already beaten me, and I just decided I was going to show her with every document, with every number, and with every calculated step how wrong she was. Everything we are comes from somewhere. And when that place disappears, you suddenly find yourself looking back with a clarity that hurts precisely because it comes too late. I was born in Valladolid in 1971. Second son of Isidro Torrealba and Consuelo Medrano, a woman with always busy hands and a quiet voice who died when I was 32. My childhood was the childhood of many kids in that Spain, which was slowly coming out of one era and entering another without fully knowing what it'd find upon crossing the threshold. I remember summers without hot water, winters with the brazier under the table, the news on the black and white TV that my father watched in silence with his arms crossed. I also remember the radio in the kitchen, always on, and my mother singing songs I never fully learned. Isidro worked in the same electrical components factory for 4 decades without missing a single day for reasons that weren't strictly necessary. It was his way of understanding dignity. He didn't make speeches about effort or responsibility. He simply got up every morning, put on his overalls as naturally as others put on a suit, and left. When I was 12, I asked him if he didn't get bored doing the same thing all the time. He looked at me for a long second and answered, "He who does his part doesn't need more explanations." I didn't understand the phrase back then. I understood it 20 years later. A day, I had to sign an audit report that cost the job of someone with much more power than me. I studied economics in Valladolid, in a faculty that in the 80s still smelled of chalk and poorly heated hallways. I graduated in 1994 at 22 years old and a self-confidence that the working reality took exactly 4 months to reduce to its rightful size. I worked 2 years as an accounting assistant in a transport company before passing the competitive exams for the State Tax Auditor's Corps in 1996. The day the job notification arrived, I took it to my father on paper, folded without an envelope. He read it slowly, folded it carefully again, and kept it in his shirt pocket. He didn't say anything for a good while. Then he put a hand on my shoulder. "Well done." 2 words. With Isidro. 2 words equaled a whole speech. That same year, in September, I met Lorena. I already talked about how that encounter was. What I didn't tell is what came after the longest part, the one that takes up the most years and the most accumulated silences. Lorena was smart. I won't deny that even today. She had a way of walking into a room that made people notice her, not out of loudness, but out of a kind of quiet confidence I mistook for a long time as strength of character. During the first years of marriage, we supported each other in a way that was genuine. When I had rough patches at work, she was there. When the household economy depended on tight calculations, she managed without complaining. There were good moments, there were. I refused to erase them because doing so would be a dishonesty that isn't up to me. But there was also an evolution I was too busy to examine in time. Over the years, Lorena developed a particular relationship with material things, not visibly or openly, but slowly, almost imperceptibly. She started talking about the apartment, the car, the future, always in terms of possession. Who'd have what? Would it be registered? In whose name? At first I interpreted it as financial prudence, something I valued given my own background. Then as anxiety for stability, understandable in someone who'd grown up in a family with chronic economic difficulties. I took too long to understand what it really was, a permanent inventory of everything she considered belonged to her or should belong to her someday. My father never spoke ill of Lorena, nor did he speak well of her in a way that went beyond reasonable courtesy. Isidro reserved his opinions about people for circumstances that demanded them. However, there's a memory I carry with me with a sharpness that doesn't fade. The last Christmas we all celebrated together in December 2022, my father remained quieter than usual during the whole dinner. Lorena talked for a large part of the evening about a renovation she wanted to do in the master bathroom, about the materials, about what the apartment would be worth if someday we decided to sell it. And Isidro listened to her without intervening. At one point, when she went to the kitchen, my father looked at me and said in a very low voice, "That woman counts things before they're hers." I took it as an older man's distrust. I smiled and changed the subject. Today, that memory weighs in a way that's hard to describe. Alvaro grew up in that house. He was a quiet kid, then a reserved teenager, then a young man who left for Madrid at 23 with the logical urgency to build something of his own away from his parents. I understood and respected it. The relationship between us was never one of those expressed frequently, but it existed in its own way. I was there when he needed me, and he knew it. I thought that was enough. I asked myself now how many times I confused superficial calm with the absence of a problem. During my father's illness months, I noticed something I preferred not to examine too much of the time. Alvaro visited his grandfather regularly when he was in Valladolid, but avoided being alone with me. When we coincided in the hospital hallway or on Isidro's apartment landing, he looked away with a speed that wasn't natural. One afternoon, I tried to ask him directly if he had something to tell me. He answered he was tired, that his grandfather's situation affected him. That was all. I accepted it because I wanted to accept it. My father's estate was small, but entirely clean. The apartment on Recoleta Street, where he'd lived the last 30 years, appraised at that time at 160,000 euros, and a savings account with 74,000 euros accumulated over decades of methodical work, and contained expenses, no debts, no mortgage, not a single number that didn't add up. Everything built on waking up early and going to bed late, as he himself said, without any drama. It was the only thing left of 60 years of honest effort, and someone had already started moving it, slowly, carefully, hoping nobody was looking. I still didn't know at that moment the exact dimension of what I was about to find, but something in the coldest part of my reasoning that part that 26 years auditing other people's accounts develop without you asking for it, had started asking unanswered questions. And when an auditor starts asking questions, he doesn't stop until he finds the numbers that don't fit. There are moments the brain doesn't keep as memories. It keeps them as physical sensations, not as images you can see from the outside, but as something that keeps happening inside the body every time you go back to them. My father's house hallway is one of those places I won't be able to visit any other way. Every time I remember it, I feel the cold of the wall against my forehead again. I smell the flowers again. I hear that voice again. Let me tell it slowly, because it deserves to be told slowly. I got up from the living room at 4:45 in the afternoon. I know because I looked at my father's wall clock when I got up, one of those darkwood clocks with Roman numerals that had hung in the same spot since I was 10. There were people everywhere, mixed voices, the dense smell of the white flower wreaths someone had placed near the sideboard, the continuous murmur of people giving condolences quietly. I've been in that living room for hours receiving condolences with a composed face and dry eyes, because my way of processing pain has always been inward, slow, in private, in silence. I needed a minute away from that noise. I went out to the hallway without saying anything to anyone. The hallway of that apartment was narrow, with high ceilings and walls painted a yellowish white that the years had been dyeing a shade between cream and ochre. On the left, the bathroom door, always with the handle a bit loose. On the right, the ajar door of the master bedroom. At the back, the small leaded glass window that faced the inner courtyard and where in summer a thread of light came in, which my mother always called the afternoon crack. I leaned against the left wall, closed my eyes, breathed. Then I heard Lorena's voice. She wasn't whispering. That's the detail that's been hardest for me to understand over time. She didn't lower her voice. She was talking on the phone as naturally as someone who's completely sure she's alone. The voice came clearly through the bedroom door opening, sharp, effortless. The first thing I noticed was the tone. Even before processing the words, the tone hit me as strange. It wasn't the tone of someone who just said goodbye to her father-in-law. There was none of the textures typical of mourning in that voice, neither the accumulated exhaustion of difficult weeks, nor the restraint of someone speaking quietly out of respect for those crying in the next room. It was a light voice, almost relaxed. Then came the words, "The father-in-law already died." My body reacted before my mind. My hand stopped. It wasn't a conscious decision. They simply ceased to exist for an instant, hanging at my sides without weight or temperature. Air stopped circulating through my lungs normally. It was as if something inside my chest slammed shut, not with pain, but with a kind of sudden solidity, like when a metal door clicks into its frame. My eyes, for no reason I can explain logically, fixed on the bathroom door handle, right in front of where I was. It was an aged brass handle with an irregular rust stain on the bottom, dark brown over dull metal. I looked at it. I kept looking at it. My brain, busy processing what my ears had just received, delegated my eyes to that unimportant object, like someone waving someone away from conversation they don't belong in. Then came the pause. Lorena listened to what they answered on the other side. I heard or thought I heard a very contained laugh on the other end of the line, and then she continued. Now he's the only one left. 3 words that over the following days would settle in my head with a precision no other sentence in the last 27 years had managed. Not the "I love you" of the early years, not the altar promise in September 1997, not any of the conversations that seemed important at the time, those 3 words. Now he's the only one left. There was another shorter pause this time, and everything they have will be mine. At that moment, 10 or 15 seconds after leaving the living room to look for a minute of calm, I stood completely still in the hallway, with the smell of flowers and candle wax wrapping the air, looking at a rusty handle, with my heart beating in a way that wasn't fear or anger or sadness. It was recognition. The kind of recognition you feel when you've been reviewing an apparently correct accounting for weeks, and suddenly find a number that doesn't add up. Not the flashy number, not the big glaring error, the small number, the one hidden on a line nobody looks at because it seems irrelevant. That instant when everything that seemed normal reorganizes in a second and forms a completely different pattern. Decades auditing documents teach you to recognize that moment, the moment when the visible structure and the real structure no longer match. What was behind that ajar door wasn't just my wife's voice talking inappropriately on the worst possible day. It was an architecture, a careful construction someone had built for months, maybe more, on ground I'd never bother to guard because I had no reason to suspect the person sleeping next to me. I didn't go into the bedroom. I didn't say anything. I pushed off the wall slowly, with movements I borrowed from somewhere where automatism still worked. And I went back to the living room. I sat down. Someone put a hand on my arm and said something I didn't register. I nodded. I shook a hand. I nodded again. On the outside, it was the son who just buried his father. On the inside, something had started to move with the silent precision of someone who already knows he can't afford a single mistake. That night back at our apartment, Lorena went to bed early. She said she was exhausted. She surely was. I stayed in the living room with the light off for an unmeasured amount of time. No TV, no radio, nothing. Just the sound of the street below and that of my own reasoning starting to sort out what I'd just received. My father's phrase came back then, clear, with that voice of his of few words and much depth. Take care of what's yours, Augustine. Don't trust someone who takes care of you too much all of a sudden. He knew, maybe not with certainty, but he sensed it. And in his own way, with his scarce words and his way of not saying things directly so as not to hurt more than necessary, he tried to warn me. I didn't listen in time. That wouldn't happen again. We tax auditors have a flaw that over the years becomes irreversible. We can't stop reading between the lines, not just at work, everywhere, in a casual conversation, in a plumber's quote, in the way someone arranges receipts in a drawer. The mind trained to detect inconsistencies doesn't turn off when you leave the office, it simply waits. During the 3 days following the funeral, I waited. I didn't act, I didn't confront, I didn't look for anything deliberately. I let the silence work and observed. Lorena moved through those days with a serenity I'd have interpreted as emotional maturity in other circumstances. She didn't cry excessively. She took condolence calls with moderation. She organized the death-related paperwork with an efficiency I myself would have valued if I hadn't had in my head, engraved with a clarity time couldn't fade. Those words from the hallway. The 4th day after the burial, a Friday morning, I went to my father's apartment with the excuse of picking up some documents the notary in charge of the probate inventory had asked us for. Lorena didn't come. She said she had errands to run. I didn't ask which ones. I entered Isidro's apartment alone for the first time since he was no longer there. The smell was the same, that specific smell of apartments of elderly people living alone for many years. A mix of old wood, bar soap, and something undefinable that has more to do with accumulated time than any specific object. I stood in the entryway for a moment without moving. Then I went to the bedroom. My father kept his important documents in a cardboard box lined with brown paper that lived on the highest shelf of the wardrobe, behind winter sweaters, folded with military precision. He always called it the poor man's chest, with that dry, unadorned irony of his. Inside you found what Isidro considered worth keeping. The family record book, Social Security booklets, old employment contracts with their faded stamps and inks, the already paid-off mortgage receipts he kept as trophies, and a small blue folder with the most recent documents. I took the box down, placed it on the bed, opened it, first found what the notary needed. The ID card, the last will certificate, the original apartment deed, everything in order, everything where it should be, just as Isidro would have wanted. My father was methodical even in the way he filed. Every paper in its place, every place justified. Then I took out the blue folder. Inside were 3 staple documents I'd never seen. The first was a copy of a public deed. The header indicated in the formal, dense typography typical of notarial documents that it was a donation deed with reservation of usufruct, signed before a notary in Valladolid. The date was printed very clearly. July 17th of the previous year, for months before my father's death. I read the entire document standing next to the wardrobe with the box still open on the bed. I read it once. I read it a second time, more slowly. The legal language of donation deeds is quite direct when you know how to interpret it. The property owner, identified as Isidro Torrealba Vega, transferred full ownership of the Recoleta Street apartment to the donee, identified with full name and ID number as Lorena Cifuentes Palomino. The donor reserved the right of lifelong usufruct, that is, the right to keep living in the apartment until his death. Upon that death, full ownership would pass without additional procedures to the donee, to Lorena, my father's apartment, the only real estate property Isidro had built with 40 years of work, registered in my wife's name since July without me knowing anything. I lowered my eyes to my father's signature at the bottom of the document. Isidro Torrealba had an unmistakable signature. For decades, I'd seen it on contracts, on school authorizations, on bank papers, a wide signature with a tall capital I and a generous flourish extending to the right with confidence. The signature appearing on that deed was something else. The strokes were faint, irregular, with the uneven pressure of someone not fully controlling their pulse. The initial was barely a stick. The flourish was cut halfway, as if the hand had lost its momentum before finishing. It was the signature of a man who didn't have control of his own hands that day. I sat on the edge of my father's bed. July 17th, I went backward in memory with the precision given by years working with dates and records. In July, Isidro had had the advanced pancreatic cancer diagnosis for 6 months. The medical team at the clinical hospital had adjusted the pain protocol in June when the previous doses were no longer enough. I remembered a conversation with the oncologist, a man in his 50s with wire-rimmed glasses who explained to me, in terminology I struggled to understand, that from that point on the treatment would be fundamentally palliative. Controlled-release morphine, administered in 12-hour patches, and a prescription sedative for nighttime agitation episodes. On July 17th, my father had been on that protocol for 3 weeks. 3 weeks with slow-release morphine and complementary sedation. Whoever had accompanied Isidro to that notary's office that day knew it. They knew exactly what state he was in. Did they know an 80-year-old man with chronic pain and high-dose opioid medication isn't in a condition to fully evaluate the consequences of a legal document? They knew he'd sign whatever was put in front of him if someone he trusted told him it was necessary. And someone he trusted told him exactly that. I remembered then the phrase Lorena had said in passing that afternoon while making dinner. I went with your father to sign a medical management authorization, just in case. A phrase spoken with the lightness of someone commenting on something unimportant. A phrase designed not to invite more questions. Medical management authorization. No, a donation deed with reservation of usufruct over a property valued at 160,000 euros. I stayed sitting on that bed for an unmeasured amount of time, the 3 stapled pages between my fingers and the silence of the apartment enveloping everything. Through the bedroom window came a cold afternoon light, late November, falling on my father's things with that indifference natural light has towards everything human. I didn't cry, not at that moment. I folded the document carefully, placed it inside the blue folder, and put the folder in my jacket's inside pocket. Then I put the box back in its place behind the folded sweaters, exactly as I found it. I closed the wardrobe and left the apartment, closing the door with the same gentleness Isidro always insisted doors should be closed with. Doors don't need slamming, they just need you to close them. Out on the street, the November cold hit directly. I walked to the car without rushing my pace. I sat inside, put my hands on the steering wheel without starting the engine. That's when I understood, with the absolute coldness that precedes decisions not made on impulse, but on certainty, that what Lorena had done wasn't an outburst or a miscalculation. It was a plan executed with patience, with precise knowledge of timing. With deliberate selection of the moment my father was least able to resist, and if there was a plan for the apartment, there was more. I still didn't know how much more, but I was going to find out. 26 years auditing other people's accounts teach one thing above all others: documents don't lie, people lie. Documents, when you know how to read them, always tell the truth. The following Monday, after finding the donation deed, I walked into the office at 8 o'clock sharp, like any other day. I greeted my co-workers. I answered 3 pending emails. I signed a follow-up report that had been on my desk since the previous week. On the outside, the same auditor as always. On the inside, I was a man with a blue folder in my locked desk drawer and a list of questions needing answers before I could make any move. The first inquiry I made from my own terminal with my professional credentials during lunch hour. Access to the Valladolid property registry is public for any citizen formally requesting it, but a state tax auditor has more direct and faster inquiry routes. In 15 minutes, I had the complete registry file for the Recoleta Street apartment in front of me. The ownership had been updated since July 28th of the previous year. Owner Lorena Cifuentes, Palomino. Lifelong usufructuary Isidro Torrealba Vega. Registration date: 11 days after signing before the notary. 11 days. Lorena had registered the donation with a diligence, leaving no doubt about the premeditation of the act. She wasn't someone acting on impulse or last-minute suggestion. She was someone with her steps counted. I then moved to the cadastre. The cadastral ownership change had been processed in August also of the previous year. Everything legal, everything correctly registered, everything executed with the meticulousness of someone who knows the procedures or relies on someone who knows them. The donation was bulletproof in its external forms. What couldn't be bulletproof was the condition of the person who'd signed it on July 17th. That afternoon, on my way home, I deviated 4 blocks from the usual route and parked in front of an office building on Santiago Street. Felix Izquierdo Pena had his office on the 3rd floor. I'd known him for 12 years from crossing paths in several administrative procedures where our subjects overlapped. He was a 62-year-old man, thin, with very short white hair and rectangular framed glasses giving him an aspect of severity his direct manner confirmed. Specialist in succession law and nullity of legal acts. With 30 years practicing in Castilla y Leon. He wasn't the type of lawyer decorating offices with framed diplomas. He had 3 file shelves, a desk with 2 monitors, and the reputation of not taking cases he didn't intend to win. I explained the situation to him bluntly. I showed him the copy of the donation deed, the records I consulted that morning, and my father's medication history on the corresponding dates I'd requested from the hospital with authorization as a direct family member. Felix listened without interrupting me, took handwritten notes in small, tight handwriting. When I finished, he took a few seconds to answer. The donation is contestable, he said. Not guaranteed, but contestable with solid grounds. If the clinical history confirms your father was under high-dose morphine and sedation on the day of signing, we can argue vitiated consent due to temporary incapacity. We need an independent medical expert to evaluate the record and issue a formal report on the probable cognitive state on that date. With that report, the deed has a serious problem. I asked him how long the process required. That depends on how much proof we have when we file the lawsuit, he answered. The more solid the file enters, the less room there is for delaying tactics. If you want to do it right, do it completely. I left Felix's office with 2 certainties: that the path existed and it was going to be long. Neither surprised me. That same week, I called Victor Gallardo Fuentes. Victor is 57 and the person who knows me best outside my immediate family. We've known each other since we were 12 from school in the Los Delicias neighborhood, where we were both mediocre in math and reasonably good at everything not evaluated. He's been working as a telecommunications technician in an infrastructure company for 20 years. He's been divorced for 8 and has a way of saying things leaving no room for ambiguity. He isn't the type of person telling you what you want to hear. He's the type telling you what you need to know. We met a Tuesday afternoon in a downtown cafe, far from the places Lorena used to go. I told him everything, not a summarized version, nor a diplomatic version. Everything. Victor listened to me with his elbows on the table and his fingers intertwined, without looking away. When I finished, he let out his breath slowly and said something I didn't expect. I saw them. I asked him to elaborate. In July, I don't remember the exact date, but it was in July. I was walking down Catanasta, San Gregorio Street, and I saw them coming out of Notary's office. Your father was walking slowly with his cane, with that way of moving he had in his last months. Lorena was holding his arm. I thought it was just any errand children do with elderly parents. It didn't seem weird. I didn't call you because there was no reason to call you. I told him there was a reason, and it was exactly what he just told me. Victor didn't hesitate a second. He said he'd testify to what he'd seen with the approximate date and circumstances. He'd do it in writing before a notary if needed, and he'd do it without anyone having to ask him twice. Not because he was looking for a leading role in the matter. He'd do it because his own mother had died 4 years earlier, and someone had tried something similar with her, with less success and more scandal. And he knew perfectly well how it felt discovering an old person's vulnerability was a resource in someone's calculations. That was his reason. He didn't need another. What I found the next day would completely change the scale of what I was investigating. I'd asked Felix to formally request from the bank the complete movements of a joint account Lorena had opened with my father, invoking my status as direct heir in the probate inventory process. The statement arrived in a sealed envelope at the lawyer's office 2 days later. He handed it to me without prior comment. He merely pointed to a column with his index finger, recurring transfers, one monthly without exception for 31 consecutive months. €300 each time, always the same day, between the 18th and 20th of each month, always to the same destination account number. 31 months, €9,300 in total, coming out of an account opened nominally for a sick old man's care expenses. I asked Felix if it was possible to identify the destination account holder. He nodded slowly. Within a legal procedure, yes, outside it not easily, but there are ways to move forward without waiting for the procedure. He paused. There's also a second line worth reviewing. If these transfers started 31 months ago, the joint account was opened before your father's illness justified its opening. That changes the timeline. 31 months back from November placed the start of the transfers in April, 2.5 years before the funeral, for months before Isidro was diagnosed with cancer. The account hadn't been opened to cover my father's care expenses. The account existed before there was an illness to care for. I leaned back in Felix's office chair and stared at the ceiling for a few seconds. Outside out the window, Valladolid continued with its gray and quiet winter afternoon, completely oblivious to everything happening in that room. I thought about Lorena that November night, going to bed at 10, looking legitimately tired. I thought about the 31 months of punctual transfers, and I thought what was beneath the surface of 27 years of marriage was considerably deeper than I'd imagined when I left my father's apartment with that blue folder under my jacket. The expert report arrived a Thursday morning, 16 days after Felix commissioned it from Dr. Amparo Villanueva Roca, medical forensic expert with 23 years of experience in cognitive capacity assessment in civil and succession proceedings. 72 pages. Technical language, precise clinical references, conclusions written with the sobriety typical of someone who knows that document will end up being read aloud in a courtroom. Felix handed it to me in his office without preambles. I sat across from him and read the conclusions first as auditors do with reports. At the end is always the summary of what matters. Dr. Villanueva established, based on Isidro Torrealba Vega's complete clinical history, provided by the Valladolid University Clinical Hospital, that the patient was receiving on the date of July 17th an extended-release morphine dose, equivalent to 90 milligrams daily, administered in 48-hour patches, combined with oral rescue doses and a long half-life benzodiazepine for nighttime agitation control. The expert indicated with supporting medical literature that this combination of major opiates with benzodiazepines in an 81-year-old patient with advanced physical deterioration routinely produces states of intermittent sedation, temporal disorientation, significant reduction of critical capacity, and high suggestibility to instructions coming from trusted persons. The final conclusion left no interpretive room. On the date of signing, Isidro Torrealba Vega wasn't in sufficient cognitive condition to fully understand the legal and patrimonial implications of the document he signed. I folded the report carefully. I didn't say anything for a moment. Felix spoke first. With this plus Victor Gallardo's testimony, plus the records you obtained from the Cadastre and Property Registry, we have a sustained nullity lawsuit. It isn't a quick process, but it's a solid process. I nodded. Then I asked him if there was any news on the destination account holder for the transfers. This time Felix didn't answer immediately. He opened a thin folder he had on one side of the desk, pulled out a sheet of paper, and placed it in front of me with the same calmness a doctor delivers a result he knows is going to hurt. The account holder was Marcos Andrade Quiles, 44 years old, domiciled in Valladolid, at an address in the Parque Sol neighborhood, profession registered in the available documents. Sports activities instructor. I read the name 3 times. Marcos Andrade Quiles. A man 9 years younger than Lorena, 9 years younger than my wife. Domiciled less than 4 kilometers from our house. Receiver of €300 monthly for 2 years and 7 months with clockwork punctuality from an account opened in my father-in-law's and my own wife's name. 31 payments. €9,300 in total. It wasn't an amount that'd destroy anyone financially. It was an amount delivered regularly, consistently, with the comfort of someone who has the flow well organized and doesn't fear anyone checking it. It was the money of someone who felt completely safe. That night, back home, Lorena made lentils. The smell came from the kitchen with that domestic normality that for years had simply been the smell of a winter afternoon at home and now seemed terribly strange to me. I sat at the table, ate, answered when she spoke to me. I asked about her plans for the next day with the usual neutral tone. Neither of us said anything that mattered. It was that night after Lorena went to bed. When I broke for the first time, I locked myself in the bathroom, turned on the sink faucet to cover any sound, and sat on the edge of the bathtub with my elbows on my knees and my face in my hands. I didn't cry immediately. It was more gradual than that. A pressure growing from my chest to my throat until I couldn't contain it anymore. And then it came out soundlessly with that kind of crying having no relief, which is pure physical exhaustion from pain not let out for too many days. I wasn't crying for the apartment. I wasn't crying for the money or the name on a cadastral registry. I was crying because my father, in his last conscious weeks, had been led by the hand to sign his own dispossession by someone he'd treated with the reserved courtesy he dedicated to people who never fully convinced him. And because I hadn't been there, because I was at the office or in a meeting or reviewing files that weren't my own father's, because I trusted someone who didn't deserve trust and left Isidro exposed to something he, in his own way, had tried to warn me was brewing. I turned the faucet on a little more, washed my face with cold water. I waited for my breathing to become regular again. Then I turned off the light and went out. There's something I need to say at this point, even if it isn't easy for me. During my father's illness years, Lorena was indeed present in ways that were real. There were afternoons I came home late from work, and she was already at Isidro's apartment, having made him dinner, having sat with him to watch the news. There were calls she answered when I was in meetings. There was a night in February when my father had a particularly severe pain episode where Lorena went to the hospital at 2 in the morning without me asking her because I was in Burgos for work and couldn't arrive on time. That happened, and for a long time I interpreted it as genuine affection. I understand now it was trust management, that every visit, every dinner made, every call answered was part of the calculated approach process pursuing a specific goal, that the generosity had a budget, and that budget was the Recoleta Street apartment. I understand it. And yet, the memory of that February early morning with my father in the ER and Lorena, sitting in the waiting room, waiting for me, doesn't disappear simply because I now know what I know. That's also part of the whole truth. What happened next, Victor told me a week later in the same cafe on Santiago Street, where we'd met before. He'd found out, through a mutual acquaintance, discreetly enough not to raise any red flags. Marcos Andrade had been teaching classes at a gym in the Rondilla neighborhood for 3 years. Lorena had been a client of the same gym for 4 years in Alvaro, as Victor confirmed to me, with the visible discomfort of someone delivering news he knows hurts more than the previous ones, had lunch with Marcos Andrade on 2 different occasions. The first time about 1.5 years ago in a downtown restaurant. The second, 4 months before Isidro's funeral, in a bar near the bus station. I stayed silent for several seconds. My son, 26 years old, had met the man receiving the money extracted from his sick grandfather's account. He'd seen him in person more than once and hadn't said anything. Victor didn't add any comment. It wasn't necessary. On the drive back home, Driving on the outer ring road with the January cold hitting the windshield, I understood the scale of what I had on my hand was already considerably larger than a contestable donation deed. There was a documentable parallel relationship, a money circuit originating in a vulnerable old man's funds, a son who'd preferred silence over honor, and a whole architecture built over years on the basis that I'd never looked closely enough. They'd bet I wouldn't look, and I'd spent my whole life learning to look exactly where nobody expects you to look. There's a fundamental difference between acting on impulse and acting on conviction. The first consumes energy and makes mistakes. The second requires something much harder, the ability to move calmly within a situation burning you inside. During the weeks following the meeting with Victor, I learned to do that with a precision I didn't know I had. The legal strategy was defined in a second meeting with Felix Izquierdo a Wednesday in January with a file already considerably more nourished than in the first visit. Felix outlined the 3 action lines with the methodology of someone who's designed these kinds of procedures enough times not to waste time on decorations. The first line was the civil lawsuit for nullity of the donation deed, based on Dr. Villanueva's expert report on Isidro's cognitive state on the signing date. Reinforced with Victor's testimony as an eyewitness to the departure from the notary's office and with the complete clinical history provided as documentary evidence. The objective was the judicial annulment of the donation and the reincorporation of the property to the hereditary estate, of which Augustin was a forced heir entitled to the full legitimate share. The second line was the contentious divorce lawsuit for breach of marital faith, providing the bank statements documenting the transfers to Marcos Andrade and any additional element obtainable regarding the nature of that relationship. Felix was direct on this point. Infidelity alone doesn't alter the patrimonial settlement in most cases, but combined with the fraudulent use of a vulnerable third party's funds, it can influence the overall judicial assessment. We need it documented. The third line was the civil claim for misappropriation of the funds extracted from the joint account, €9,300 with complete documentary backing in the already obtained statements. It wasn't the largest figure in the file, but it was the cleanest in evidentiary terms. Identified transfers, identified receiver, identified origin of funds. 3 fronts, each with its own documentation, its own procedural calendar, its own specific weight, and all pointing in the same direction. Felix added a clarification before I left. There's one thing that could considerably strengthen the whole. If at any time inside your own home and in conversations where you yourself are present, statements are made confirming knowledge of the facts by your wife, that'd have value. In Spain, recording a conversation where the recorder is an active party is in a gray area variably interpreted by courts. It isn't foolproof on its own, but as a corroborating element of an already documented file, it can tip the scales. The decision is yours. If you decide to do it, let it be in shared use spaces and with you present in the conversation. I didn't answer at that moment, but 2 days later, a Friday afternoon, while Lorena was at the gym, I placed a compact voice recorder inside the half-open drawer of the desk we shared at home for domestic management. Small, black, the kind used to record lectures, sound-activated, battery for 72 continuous hours. I didn't have to wait long. Tuesday of the following week, Lorena came into the office while I was reviewing some work documents and started talking about the Recoleta Street apartment as naturally as someone planning something they consider resolved. She said she'd been thinking about the layout. The master bedroom needed another furniture orientation. She'd seen some bathroom tiles she thought were suitable. She talked for several minutes about specific renovations, materials, approximate budgets. At one point, without any special inflection, she mentioned the papers were already in order for months, and we just had to wait for the inventory paperwork to finish to be able to move more freely. I nodded. I told her I thought it was reasonable to think about those things with time. I asked her if she'd already consulted with a professional about the costs. She answered yes. She'd talked to a neighborhood contractor. She'd asked for a quote for spring. When Lorena left the office, I kept looking at the half-open drawer for a few seconds. Then I went back to the work documents I had in front of me and continued reading from where I'd left off. That night, I almost made the only serious mistake of the whole process. Lorena was sitting on the couch with her phone, answering messages with the TV on in the background. I came into the living room, intending to sit down and read. I sat down, opened my book, and then she let out a small, intimate laugh, the kind that escapes when you read something really funny, and hit it quickly with the discretion of someone remembering they aren't alone. That laugh wasn't the laugh of someone reading something funny on a screen. It was the laugh of someone who has a place to go when home life feels too small. I knew it. I'd heard it before, without registering it, filed in that area of memory, where we keep things we see and decide not to see. I closed the book. I got up, told her I was going to get water. In the kitchen, standing at the sink, with the faucet off and the empty glass in my hand, I was about to go back to the living room and say everything, put the expert report on the table, the statements, Marcos Andrade Quiles's name, the donation deed, Victor's statement. Put an end to that exhausting performance of a normality that hadn't existed for months. I lasted approximately 40 seconds in that state. Then I put the glass under the faucet, filled it, drank slowly, and reminded myself what Felix had said in the first meeting. The more solid the file enters, the less room there is for delaying tactics. A premature confrontation without the formally initiated process gave Lorena time to react, to move what could be moved, to prepare a version. The file needed to be filed before she knew it existed. I went back to the living room, sat down, opened the book to the page where I'd left off. Lorena didn't look up from her phone. During those weeks, I also reorganized my own assets with Felix's help. The assets I'd acquired before the marriage in 1997 were documented with date and origin. The personal account funds I maintained since before the wedding with their historical movements were duly accredited as private property. It wasn't a spectacular amount, but it was clean and correctly separated from the marriage's community property. When the settlement came, every number would have its backing. In parallel, Felix contacted the Medical Association to verify Dr. Villanueva's credentials, facing her eventual intervention as a judicial expert. Everything in order, everything verifiable. The file grew with the same logic a well-built audit report grows, layer upon layer. Each new addition supported by the previous one, without any link lacking documentary backing. Victor called me a February afternoon with something extra. He'd spoken completely naturally with a neighbor from my father's building who'd known him for years. The neighbor remembered seeing Lorena arrive with Isidro by car summer day the previous year, helping him up the stairs, and coming back out alone 40 minutes later. She remembered the day because it coincided with an elevator breakdown that had kept the whole building on edge that week. She didn't know the meaning of what she'd seen, but she remembered it clearly. A neighbor, a friend, a medical report, a cadastral registry, bank statements, a domestic recording with legal guidance, and a deed with a trembling signature that could no longer defend what it intended to defend. Lorena, meanwhile, kept making plans for spring. She talked about the apartment as something that was already hers. She talked about the future with that confidence someone has who thinks they've covered every possible angle. One afternoon, she mentioned in passing she'd thought she could sell the apartment in a few years if they found something better. It was an asset, giving options an asset. That's what she called the apartment where my father had lived 30 years. The apartment where my mother died in a hospital bed Isidro had brought to the bedroom because she wanted to die at home. To the apartment with the darkwood clock and Roman numerals and the smell of accumulated decades. An asset giving options. Felix set the lawsuit filing date for the first week of March. 3 weeks left. Lorena still knew nothing, and the file at that point was completely irreversible. Nobody talks about the exhaustion maintaining a mask for weeks produces. Not the physical exhaustion, which also exists and accumulates, but the other one. That specific wear and tear of having to regulate every gesture, every tone of voice, every silence, so it occupies exactly the expected space and not a single one more. Sleeping next to someone you no longer recognize, sitting at the same table, answering when spoken to, smiling at times when a normal man smiles. During those February weeks, That was the most strenuous job I ever did in my life, and I'd spent 26 years auditing companies with irregularities their owners preferred not to see. The first serious crack happened a Wednesday afternoon at the office. I'd asked the clinical hospital to send me a full copy of my father's clinical file to reinforce the expert's documentation. The envelope arrived via internal mail on my desk inside a beige cardboard folder with the hospital's letterhead printed in the top corner. I opened it intending to review only the medication prescription dates, which was what Felix needed for a specific procedural detail. Inside the file, between 2 pages of lab reports, there was a small envelope folded in half, no letterhead, handwritten with my father's handwriting on the back for Augustine. When the time comes, I sat with the envelope between my fingers without opening it for what must have been 2 or 3 minutes. Around me, the office continued with its usual noise of keyboards and phones and hallway conversations. I was sitting in my chair with that white paper envelope in my hands, as if it were something fragile that could break if I squeezed it wrong. I opened it slowly. It was 2 pages written in Isidro's handwriting. That calligraphy of his with firm strokes and tight words I'd seen my whole life on grocery list notes and birthday cards and on Christmas envelope letterheads. Undated. He'd written it sometime in his last months when he could still hold a pen with enough control. I'm not going to reproduce here what that letter said. There are things belonging only to whoever received them. But I will say my father spoke of me with a frankness he never used out loud. He admitted having been a man of few hugs and many demands, he said, with the economy of words that always characterized him. The pride he felt for the son I'd become was the kind you don't say because it brings shame, but that didn't make it any less real. And at the end, almost like a postscript, there was a single sentence I struggled to reread without my vision blurring. Don't let anyone take what you built. Neither mine nor yours. He knew. Until the end, he knew. I got up from my chair and went to the bathroom down the hall. I locked the stall, turned the sink faucet all the way up, leaned on the edge with my arms extended and my head bowed. And I stayed like that for the time it took me to regain control over my breathing. The sound of the water covered everything else. Fine. When I returned to my desk 10 minutes later, the letter was kept in my jacket's inside pocket, folded next to the blue folder I'd carried with me since the day I found it in my father's wardrobe. I finished the day, signed what needed to be signed. I answered pending emails. I left at 7:15. The second crack was harder to manage because it happened in public. A mid-February night, Lorena arranged dinner at home with her sister Encarna and her husband, Rodrigo. An ordinary dinner of those repeating every so often with no pretense other than habit. I was sitting at the table in my usual spot, participating in the conversation with just the right dose of presence the situation required. At one point, while clearing the first course plates, Lorena mentioned the Recoleta Street apartment. She did it as naturally as I still find hard to describe without a minimum of effort. She said it was a pity not being able to fix it up sooner. The neighborhood had gone up a lot in value in recent years. Maybe when all the death paperwork was done, they'd renovate it to rent it and thus have an income. Encarna nodded with that friendly disposition of people who don't question what's said at a family table. Rodrigo commented the downtown rental market was good, and Lorena smiled with the serenity of someone talking about something she considers resolved. I had a fork in my hand. I ate, drank water. I participated in the subject change coming next, which was something related to some roadworks on the street where Encarna lived. For the rest of the dinner, I didn't say anything that wasn't absolutely ordinary. But there was a moment while Lorena laughed at something Rodrigo had said when I looked at her from my spot at the table with a clarity I'd never felt before. Not anger, not sadness, something colder than both. The clarity of someone who already holds all the cards and is just waiting for the right moment to put them on the table. 3 days later, Alvaro called to say he'd come to Valladolid the following weekend. He arrived as Saturday at noon with the same old travel backpack and that way of walking into the house that hadn't changed since he was 16. We ate all 3 together. The conversation was polite and superficial, the kind of exchange occupying space without really filling it. In the afternoon, while Lorena was out running an errand, Alvaro came into the office where I was reviewing some papers and closed the door carefully. He sat in the chair, facing the desk, stayed quiet a moment like measuring something. Then he said, "Dad, I want to talk to you." I looked at him. I waited. "I think there are things you should know about what happened with Grandpa, about some decisions that were made." A silence followed, lasting about 10 seconds. Alvaro looked at me with the expression of someone who's rehearsed a conversation and at the moment of having it discovers words don't work the same way as in rehearsal. I didn't answer him. I looked at him calmly, without hostility, unhurried. I waited for him to continue, but he'd already seen something in my expression telling him what he needed to know, because what I didn't say in those 10 seconds was clearer than any sentence that I already knew. I knew everything, and the moment Alvaro could have been part of the solution had passed months ago. My son looked down, nodded slowly like facing something confirming what he already feared. He stood up, told me he was going out for a while, and closed the door as softly as he'd opened it. We didn't talk again that weekend about anything substantive. The third crack I found alone. An early morning in late February. I'd been awake for 2 hours when I decided to get up and go to my father's apartment. I had a key. The apartment was still as it was, pending inventory paperwork. I entered in silence, turning on no light other than the hallways, and went straight to the living room. Isidro's armchair was still in its place by the window, facing the turned-off TV. A dark fabric armchair with slightly worn armrests. The one he invariably occupied in the afternoons with his newspaper folded in half and his glasses on his forehead. I sat in it. The apartment was completely silent. The orange light from the street lamps came through the window, drawing long shadows on the walls. It smelled clothes like accumulated dust over a few months and still way beneath all that. That Isidro smell I don't know how to describe, except saying it was my father's smell, and probably sooner or later it'd disappear. I also asked myself if it was worth it. Not the legal process, not the strategy, but everything together. If 4 decades of honest work, of a life built with judgment and effort, of a marriage that at some point was real, even if it wasn't anymore, could be reduced to a file in a lawyer's office and a name on a cadastral registry. I found no answer that night, but I found no reason to stop either. March entered Valladolid with a dry and persistent cold slipping through old window frames and making the hallway parquet creak at odd hours. It was the kind of cold that doesn't fully yield even at noon, settling and intending to stay and forcing people to walk fast down the streets with their hands in their pockets and looking down. For me, however, those first weeks of the month had a completely different temperature. Inside, everything was extraordinarily still, the kind of stillness preceding things with no turning back. The file was closed, not meaning it couldn't grow more, but meaning it was already enough. Felix had told me, with his usual economy of words, in the last February meeting, "What we have is solid. Presenting more documentation now would be accumulating by inertia, not out of necessity." The point had arrived where continuing building the case was a way of postponing the inevitable, and I've been postponing things that already had a date for too many weeks. The date was Tuesday, March 12th. Felix had set it with the criteria of leaving enough time for the summons to reach Lorena with the correct legal deadlines. But without extending more than necessary the period, I had to keep inhabiting that manufactured normality. When he told me over the phone, I wrote the date down in the margin of a paper I had on the desk, looked at it for a second, and circled it. Then I continued with what I was doing. 12 days left. During those 12 days, Lorena lived with a carelessness that, seen from where I was, had a bit of vertigo, not because it was faked, but exactly because it wasn't. It was the genuine carelessness of someone having no reason to suspect the ground under her feet isn't where she thinks it is. She made plans, made phone calls, made decisions about future things with the ease of someone managing a stable present. One Thursday afternoon, she came home with a decor magazine and left it open on the dining room table, pointing to a photograph of a renovated bathroom with light-colored tiles. She asked me what I thought. I told her it was pretty. She nodded with satisfaction and commented it looked quite a bit like what she had in mind for the Recoleta Street apartment. I told her yes, it did. She closed the magazine, went to the kitchen. I kept looking at the cover for a few moments, then moved it to the side of the table and went back to what I was doing. There was something strangely orderly in those days a peculiar geometry in the exact distance between what Lorena thought was happening and what was really happening. 27 years of marriage reduced to that invisible crack, wide as a continent. We both crossed every morning without either of us naming it. She because she didn't know it existed. I because I knew exactly where it ended. The Saturday before the summons Tuesday, Alvaro called. I picked up in the office. The conversation was brief. He asked how I was. I told him fine. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, one of those having more content than the words surrounding them. Then he told me he wanted to come to Valladolid soon. There were things he needed to clear up. I answered whenever he wanted. The door was open. I hung up. There was no grudge in that answer, no warmth either. It was simply the truth. The door was still open, but the things on the other side weren't the same as when Alvaro left for Madrid at 23 with his travel backpack and his plans. I didn't tell him that on the phone. There was a time for that conversation, and it wasn't then. Sunday, I spent alone in my father's apartment, finishing reviewing the documentation Felix needed in an orderly format for the next day's filing. I took the complete file, the original donation deed with its registry copy, Dr. Villanueva's expert report with its 72 pages and unequivocal conclusions, the joint account bank statements with the 31 underlined transfers, Victor's written declaration before a notary, the building neighbor's additional testimony Felix had formally collected, and the transcript of relevant excerpt from a domestic recordings Felix himself had reviewed and selected with legal judgment. I placed each document in its corresponding folder. I checked the page numbers were sequential. I verified the annexes were in the order indicated in the index. I did it with the same meticulousness I'd reviewed hundreds of files throughout my 26-year career, except this time the file wasn't from a company with accounting irregularities. It was from my own marriage, the house my father had lived in, the 40 years of honest work of a man who got up every morning without needing anyone to explain why. When I finished, it was 8:15 p.m. I washed my hands in my father's bathroom sink, that small sink with the hot water faucet always taking exactly 3 minutes to warm up. I dried myself with the towel, still hanging on the same hook where Isidro had last put it. I turned off the light. In the hallway, I stopped a moment in front of the bedroom door, the same ajar door from where Lorena's voice had come the day of the funeral 4 months ago. It was closed now. The rusty brass handle remained the same with its irregular stain on the bottom, brown over dull metal. I looked at it a second, then took the file folders, put them in my bag, and went out to the street. On Monday, Felix filed the lawsuits before the Valladolid Court of First Instance, the civil lawsuit for nullity of the donation deed due to vitiated consent, the contentious divorce lawsuit providing proof of infidelity and misappropriation of funds, and the civil claim for the €9,300 siphoned from the joint account. 3 different procedures filed the same day with the same supporting file. Felix confirmed the filing to me by phone at 12:40 a.m., while I was sitting at my office desk with a coffee cup that had gone cold without me noticing. He just said, "Registered, the court will notify within established deadlines." I thanked him, hung up. I drank the cold coffee. I continued with the report I had on the desk. That afternoon, Lorena got home before me. When I walked in, she was in the kitchen, making dinner with the radio on, a music station she usually put on at that hour. She greeted me normally. She asked me if I wanted dinner early or later. I told her whenever she wanted. I hung my coat on the hall rack and went to the office. I sat in the chair. I looked at the desk for a moment. Tuesday, March 12th, Felix would call Lorena under the pretext of a necessary meeting to review Isidro's probate inventory documentation. A routine procedure, no air questions in the months following a death. She'd go without suspecting anything. I know because that's how trust works when it hasn't been questioned. It doesn't generate alerts. It doesn't produce precaution. It simply opens the door. From the kitchen came the smell of sautéing and the sound of the radio with a song I didn't recognize. Lorena hummed something for a few seconds. Then the sound of tap water covered everything else. Tomorrow at 11 a.m. in Felix Izquierdo's office on Santiago Street. Lorena would walk in believing she was going to sign inventory papers and find something completely different waiting for her across the table. Tuesday, March 12th, I got up at 6:15. Not because I had to. I got up because staring at the ceiling in the dark for 3 hours made no practical sense anymore. I dressed slowly in the clothes I'd left ready the night before on the bedroom chair. Dark suit, white shirt, gray tie. The same attire I wore when appearing in formal procedures wasn't a minor detail. It was a statement of intent nobody would see except me. I ate breakfast alone in the kitchen. Lorena was still sleeping. At 7:40, I left the apartment quietly and walked to the car parked on the street. The morning cold was biting, the damp kind getting down your jacket collar regardless of how you close it. I walked slowly, I wasn't in a hurry. The meeting was at 11, it was almost 8. I had plenty of time to do what I wanted to do before going to Felix's office. I went to my father's apartment. I entered, turned on the hallway light, went straight to the living room. The dark wood clock with Roman numerals was still on the wall above the sideboard. It said 8:03. It had always worked with a precision Isidro maintained with the same constancy he maintained everything else, punctual, without fuss, because that's how well-made things should work. I stood in front of it for a moment, without sitting, without touching anything, just looking at it. Then I turned off the light and locked the door. I arrived at Felix's Gallardo's office at 10:20. Victor Gallardo was already there, sitting in one of the waiting area chairs, still wearing his coat and an expression that wasn't exactly solemn, but wasn't anything else either. He shook my hand without saying anything. There was no need to say anything. Felix received us in his inner office. On the desk were 2 neat folders, the usual glasses of water, and the same functional austerity of someone not needing scenery to do his job well. We went over the meeting order in 10 minutes. Felix would speak first. I'd speak when he gave me the floor. Victor would remain in the room as a civil witness, without intervening, unless directly asked to. At 11:05, the secretary announced Lorena had arrived. She walked into the office with her coat open and her bag slung over her forearm with that natural ease she always had in formal settings. She stopped in the doorway when she saw me. A second of immobility, brief, any casual observer would have taken for ordinary surprise at a coincidence. Then she composed her expression and walked toward the chair Felix indicated across the desk. "I didn't know you were coming," she told me with a neutral tone of someone sizing up a situation before deciding how to position herself within it. I told her it was necessary for her to be there. She sat down, crossed her hands over her bag, looked at Felix with the expectation of someone waiting for an administrative paperwork meeting to start. Felix opened the first folder, spoke for 22 minutes without interruption, didn't raise his voice at any time. He presented each element with the precision of someone knowing each piece's specific weight and exactly what order to place them in, so the whole is unappealable. He started with the donation deed, the date, the signer's identification, and Isidro Torrealba Vega's documented medical condition on that date. According to Dr. Villanueva's expert report, he placed the report on the table open to the conclusions page, facing Lorena. She looked at it, didn't touch it. Then came the joint account statements. Felix arranged them in chronological order. 31 months of transfers with the destination account number highlighted on each line. He named Marcos Andrade Quiles with first name, last names, and address. He explained the nature of the documented relationship and the timeline of its start preceding the joint account's opening by several months. Lorena stopped looking at the documents at that point. She stared at somewhere on the wall behind Felix, and stayed like that for the rest of the presentation. Victor's written declaration came next with a description of what he'd witnessed in July outside the Cadenas, the San Gregorio Street Notary. Then the building neighbor's testimony. Then the transcript of domestic recording excerpts selected by Felix. Among them the comment about papers already in order and spring renovation plans. When Felix finished, there was a silence lasting several seconds. Lorena was the first to speak. She did it with a voice trying to be firm and staying on the edge. "This is manipulation. The apartment thing was Isidro's decision. Nobody forced him into anything. He wanted to do it." Felix answered calmly. "That's exactly what the judicial procedure will determine. The expert report establishes that on the signing date, the donor wasn't in cognitive condition to evaluate the act's implications. That's the basis of the lawsuit. The decision on the merits belongs to the judge. There was no relationship." Lorena's voice went up half a pitch. Those transfers are personal loans I intend to repay. Felix calmly pointed to the statements on the table. 31 months without a contract, without interest, without any debt acknowledgement document. Within a contentious divorce procedure providing infidelity proofs, qualifying those movements also belongs to the judge. Lorena then looked directly at me for the first time since entering the office. She was looking for something in my face, a crack, a hesitation, any sign this could still be negotiated from another angle. I held her gaze easily, without anger, without satisfaction, simply still, hands on the table and straight back. That's what disarmed her. Not the documents, not Felix's words, not Victor's presence on the other side of the room, my silence, the total absence of any emotion she could use as leverage. You've been plotting this for months, she said with a mix of accusation and disbelief, sounding like someone who just understands a ground she thought solid has been moving under her feet for a long time. I didn't answer. It wasn't necessary. What came next was more contained than I'd have expected. There was no scene, there was no visible breakdown. Lorena's a woman with a lot of control. I always knew that. And that control didn't entirely abandon her even then. What had disappeared was the confidence. That particular, almost structural confidence she'd worn for months like wearing clothes that fit well, evaporated in the time it took her to read the expert report conclusions and see her own name next to Marcos Andrade's on the same line of an official document. When Felix told her she could review the documentation with her own lawyer before any formal statement, she picked her bag off her lap, stood up slowly, and headed for the door without saying anything else. In the doorway, she stopped a second with her back to us. She didn't turn around, she left. Victor exhaled through his nose with the discretion of someone having held his breath longer than usual. Felix closed the folders with his usual methodical order. I stayed seated a few moments, more looking at the desk, at the untouched water glasses, at the perfectly arranged order of documents taking months to gather and 22 minutes to expose. I didn't feel relief. That wasn't the feeling. It was something more like what you experience when a long process reaches the point where it no longer requires direct intervention. A kind of functional conclusion, without music, without ceremony, with the same sobriety any well-done job ends with. Felix shook my hand saying goodbye and said the procedures would follow their normal course. He'd keep me informed of every judicial notification. The donation nullity process was the one taking the most time, but the file was built to endure. I went out to the street with Victor. We walked a block in silence before he said anything. He just said, "You did it right." I answered I'd learned from someone who never needed more than 2 words to say what mattered. Victor nodded. He understood. Justice, when it arrives through proper channels, doesn't arrive with a bang. It arrives in certified envelopes, in notifications with registry numbers. In resolutions the court clerk reads with the same tone regardless of what they contain. Nobody explains that when you start, that the end of something consuming months of life, of silence, of calculation, and a pain not always having a place to go, arrives on printed paper with official letterhead and blue ink stamp. The donation nullity procedure was resolved 14 months after filing the lawsuit. The Valladolid Court of First Instance ruling declared the July 17th donation deed null and void due to vitiated consent, based mainly on Dr. Villanueva's expert report and Isidro Torrealba Vega's complete clinical documentation. The Recoletas Street apartment was reincorporated into the hereditary estate with all its registry effects. As a forced heir entitled to the full legitimate share, I received full ownership of the property valued at €160,000. The civil claim for the funds siphoned from the joint account was resolved in less time, with a favorable ruling including accumulated interest since the first transfer date. The total amount ordered by the judge was €23,200, fully restored within the established deadline. The divorce was decreed contentious. The community property regime was settled as legally established with the documentation Felix had prepared from the beginning to prove each party's private assets. Lorena walked out of the marriage without the inheritance she'd built for months, without the economic backing of 27 years of shared life beyond what the legal minimum recognized, and with her name linked in a judicial file to facts that file described with documentary precision. I don't know what happened with Marcos Andrade Quiles. I didn't look for him. He wasn't part of what I needed to resolve. I know regarding what started this story. A man who went out to the hallway for air on the worst day of his life and heard something he shouldn't have heard and decided in 10 seconds what he'd do with it. That end of the day, Felix called me to announce the nullity ruling. I hung up the phone, sat at my office desk for a few minutes, and then continued with the pending report. There was no celebration. I didn't seek it. That wasn't the point. The conversation with Alvaro was different from how I'd imagined it during the preparation months. He came to Valladolid a Saturday in May, weeks after the confrontation in Felix's office. He arrived more serious than usual, without his usual backpack, with an expression being a mix of regret and something not quite being enough yet. We sat in my father's apartment living room, which by then was legally mine. With the afternoon coming through the window and the usual silence in those walls, he told me he was sorry. He'd made a serious mistake. He'd chosen poorly when he should have chosen well, and he knew it since before everything came to light. I listened to him until the end without interrupting him. Then I told him what I had to tell him as calmly as I'd done everything else during those months. That I believed him. I didn't doubt his repentance was sincere. The affection I had for him hadn't disappeared and wouldn't disappear, because that isn't how it works between a father and a son, at least not between this father and this son. But there was a difference between affection and backing in all its material forms had ceased to exist the day Alvaro chose protecting his own comfort over his grandfather's dignity and his father's honor. It wasn't a punishment. I explained it with that specific word, so there'd be no possible confusion. It wasn't accumulated anger or retaliation. It was a consequence. Consequences aren't negotiated or softened with late apologies, however sincere they are. They exist because acts exist and stay as long as they must stay. Alvaro didn't answer for a good while. Then he nodded slowly with his head bowed. He got up, hugged me briefly, something I didn't expect. He picked up his coat from the chair and left. That was the most honest goodbye we'd had in years. I know by now you've been listening to this story for a long time and wondering if in the end, with everything resolved and everything in its place, the man telling it feels good. It's a legitimate question. I asked myself that too many times before having the answer. The answer is it isn't as simple as feeling good. There's a real, concrete, and measurable gain. The apartment where my father lived 30 years remains in the family. His name won't remain in memory as an old man emptied out while alive. The money extracted from his account for 31 months was returned with interest by court ruling. The person designing that scheme with patience and calculation faced her legal consequences without me having to break any rule, without having to sink to any ground other than law and documentation. That's good. Said without emphasis, without drama. It's good, but there's also something no ruling gives back. The months my father was sick and I was at the office, conversations we didn't have because neither of us was particularly prone to having them. The letter he saved for me between 2 lab report pages written sometime when he could still hold a pen and reach in my hands for months after he was gonna know if I'd read it. I carry that letter with me since the day I found it, folded in my jacket's inside pocket, the same one where I kept the blue folder when I left Isidro's apartment that November Friday. I haven't framed it or kept it in any special place. It's in my pocket because that's where he put it, between medical papers, like someone leaving something where he knows the right person will find it when needed. A Sunday in June, 3 weeks after the nullity ruling notification arrived, I went back to the Recoletas Street apartment in the afternoon. I entered, turned on the hallway light, walked through the rooms with the slowness of someone and no rush for anything in particular. I stopped in the living room. The darkwood clock was still on the wall above the sideboard with its Roman numerals and its precise ticking. I looked at it for a good while, and Isidro had bought it at a downtown hardware store in 1978, the year I was 7, and he'd just gotten a morning shift after years requesting the change. He told me once in passing like he told things that mattered to him, without underlining, without seeming like he was telling you something important. I bought it when I finally slept peacefully. That was it. 46 years hanging in the same spot. It survived my mother decades of apartment renovations, 8 months of illness, everything coming after. I approached the sideboard, took the letter from my jacket's inside pocket, unfolded it carefully, read it one more time from beginning to end, with the living room light above, with the clock ticking in the background marking seconds with the same imperturbability as always. My father's last line said, "Don't let anyone take what you built, neither mine nor yours." I folded the letter, put it away, looked at the clock. It was still on time.